we'll just get right into it. So there are three main narrative threads throughout Boy from the North Country. There's you growing up in upstate New York. There's you coming home at the end of your mother's life. And there's this third thread about your mom's life as an actress in New York in the 1970s. How did you balance those three threads?
Well, first, just thanks to you guys at Zibby's, and thanks to Zibby, who's been such a champion of this book. I'll just start by saying something about how we ended up here. So Chloe, who lives around the corner, came into the bookshop maybe 6 months before the book came out, and knew Zibby's writing and the books that she cared about, and said, I want to tell you about this book that my friend wrote, and Zibby was really interested in the book, and has since invited us to do this event, and also had me on 2 of her podcasts and made Boy from the North Country her book of the month. And to me, this is just, it's a beautiful story of the ways that books get out in the world. And as a writer, you spend so much time at your desk trying your best to tell a story, but then once you're done, you really rely on friends and people like Zibby to come together and help more people find out about your work. So very grateful to Chloe and to Zibby, and to everyone who works here at the shop, who have been so supportive of the book. So yeah, I mean, the different narrative threads, I think in some ways it's a kind of dual coming of age story. It's it's about my own experience. I call this work of autofiction. The character I call Evan, which is my middle name. My mother's character I called June. Her middle name was Juna. And it's the heart of the story is really about my experience leaving home and being in search for my own sense of identity, and then coming back at the end of what turned out to be the end of my mother's life, and sort of realizing that so much of who I am or wanted to be came not from that experience of venturing out into the world, but rather from returning and coming into an understanding of what my mother had given me. So in some sense, it's that kind of classic oldest story ever told of a person who goes on a long journey and realizes that the thing they were looking for was waiting for them where they began. But the reason I say it's a dual coming of age story is that about a third of this book is told in my mother's voice, and it's her character recounting her youth as this actress in the sort of mid-70s Bohemian New York world. And it's so much my understanding of myself through understanding the world that shaped her. And so much of my love of literature and art came from her, and I encountered that as a child in the forms that she gave it to me. But this is sort of the story of the events and the experiences that shaped who she was, and it's a sort of tribute to that 1970s Bohemian New York arts world, and the events that made her who she is.
Thanks. So as I was preparing for today, I was looking back through a decade's worth of correspondence that we've sent to each other.
Terrible idea.
And I found, honestly, it was most of that should stay buried.
Over preparation.
But in 2017, you wrote me this email.
Don't tell me.
Of course, I don't want to be the writer in the woods with his pen and his page. And then now, in 2025, you've written this book, Boy from the North Country, about growing up in the woods, and you wrote it in the woods with your pen and your page.
Nope, computer. Typed on the computer.
Typed on the computer.
No
That's
pen,
what
no
I should have done
page.
with these notes. No, but could you talk to us a little bit about what it means to you to be from the North Country?
Let's talk about the title, because of course it's a reference to the Dylan song, Girl from the North country, but it's more than that. A boy from the North Country is someone who sort of comes from afar, maybe a slightly more provincial or sheltered background, and wants to leave home for a more expressive, creative life. And when I was a teenager, first encountering Dylan, that's of course part of what made me interested in him as an artist. He's sort of the archetypal boy from the North Country. And the book is also interested in a few other artists who sort of follow that life trajectory. And one who meant a lot to me in the writing of this book and who plays a role in the background, is Marc Chagall. Chagall has such a fascinating life story. His parents were illiterate. He grew up in this small shtetl in Ukraine, or actually what's now Belarus. And by the time he's in his early 20s, he's living in Paris. He's at the center of Parisian modernism. And what does he do at that moment? The work that makes him well known is that he paints his hometown. He paints this small shtetl that he was trying to get away from, right? And he paints the fiddler on the roof. But he can only see Vitebsk, his hometown, through the lens of Paris. He can only understand what's interesting about his own life and his own childhood through the lens of the place that he's gotten away to. And I think for me, when I was growing up in upstate New York, like every other teenager, I thought it was the most boring place in the world. I was desperate to get away. I spent most of my 20s living abroad. And then, I came home when my mom got sick. And suddenly I was looking at the place that I was from through a different lens. And, what I started feeling at that point in my life was, um, so much of what felt that it had made me distinct or made me the person that I am was actually not that I had spent my 20s in Berlin or Oxford, or like a lot of people that I knew at that point. Okay, they spent some time abroad in their 20s. That's not interesting. It's cliche, right? What had really made me myself was the experience of growing up in the world my mother created, right? Which was, a dozen acres in the woods with chickens and some sheep and dogs and a horse. And we didn't have TV. And my mom somehow managed to like keep me off the internet until I was 12. And what was really celebrated and valued in that world was creativity. And she was from a really early age. My first memories are of her reading to me. And so Boy from the North Country is, that title is sort of my tribute to in understanding that, really what has made me who I am and the writer I'm trying to be is, that world that she created. And the book is about coming into that understanding of a sense of self and identity.
Could you read to us a little bit about this world that your mother created?
Sure. So I think, the challenge I thought about the most in writing this book was how to capture the complexity of who my mother was in a book. And you can't fit people into books. They're not large enough. So you make certain choices. And I think the pressure that I felt the most was, how do I capture the complexity and richness of who my mother was in this character that I'm going to create. So I'll read a short section that I think captures the range of who she was. On winter afternoons, we walked into the snow in our warmest coats, my mother carrying her wooden axe. Standing over maple trunks that fell in that year's storms, she lifted the axe high overhead and swung it into the fallen trees. The rhythmic thudding echoed through the woods. Sometimes the sound paused, and I turned to see my mother struggling with the axe overhead, its blade stuck in the round cut of wood. A woman in a green winter jacket with auburn hair about her shoulders and a fierce glare in her eyes. She heaved the axe and cut of wood to the ground, pressed her black boot to the heart of the wood, and withdrew the axe with a sharp breath. We carried the wood to the iron grate beside the fireplace. My mother set our burnt offering in the stove. She lit a match and set the flame beneath the kindling and stoked the fire with a steel poker. The flames blazed and warmth spread through the den, and my mother said, "Where shall we go tonight?" I walked to the bookshelf and, like an adventurer surveying the globe, grandly pointed to our destination. On the sofa by the fire, we visited Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest and King Arthur in Camelot. My mother's eyes moved across the page, her voice changing tone and temperament as she conjured the Arthurian knights into the room. I have no memory earlier than this. My mother's words creating the world. Once each year, we ventured to the city. We rose early in the morning, shoveled snow from the driveway, and glided in the station wagon down the forest highway. At the bridge with views of the city, we met a stream of cars, and I began to worry if we were all going to fit into the theater. Then, with relief, I remembered there was more than one theater in New York. Curious about the destination of our fellow theatergoers, I stared through car windows, wondering if that mustached man might seek a stern lecture by Arthur Miller or a heartwarming romance, such as Beauty and the Beast. Perhaps he will surprise us all by walking straight into Cats. At the theater, my mother gave her name and received 2 tickets, and we sat in enchanted anticipation as the audience took their seats and the actors came on stage. Then the figures began to enact the Ibsen or Chekhov drama we had traveled this great distance to enjoy, and I was mesmerized to see my mother, who the day before had split a fallen maple tree into firewood, reciting to herself the actor's every line.
Beautiful. I think a passage shows how you grew up between these 2 spaces, Goshen and New York. Could you talk to us a little bit about those spaces and the physical spaces where you wrote this book?
Yeah, well, the part of the book is centered on, my mother recounting, for me, the sort of experiences that sit behind this passage. I mean, why does she know these Ibsen and Chekhov lines? And, it's about her experience as an actress in her 20s. And so by strange coincidence, I live in the apartment that she lived in that period of time, which is this old rent-stabilized walk-up in Yorkville on the Upper East Side. And I wrote the book between there and the house that I describe. I think places have a sort of magical resonance. Places are so deeply imbued with meaning and with memory. And, so much of what I cared about in writing this book was sort of conjuring those memories or the significance of those places, the memories that are embedded within those places, and sort of raising them to the surface and turning them into a story. And it was a magical experience to be writing in those 2 places. I felt the resonances and her spirit and all of that history in those places.
I mean, both feel like they're a little bit out of time.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Yeah.
been there. I guess you just touched on, how your mom knows the Chekhov lines, how your mom knew the Ibsen lines. Could you talk to us a little bit about her time in New York in the 1970s?
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic story. I mean, she comes to New York in the early 70s. She dropped out of Bennington College, and she wanted to be an actress. And the New York that she entered was so rich artistically, and she ends up studying, with these two sort of iconic figures of the post-war New York art world. The first is Norman Rabin, who's the youngest child of Sholem Aleichem, and Rabin is this painter and taskmaster, and he has a studio on the 11th floor of Carnegie Hall, and the rule is that anyone can walk into this studio. He doesn't care what your credentials are. He doesn't care whether or if or where you went to college. It's the one credential that matters is, will you let him yell at you until he turns you into an artist, or you realize that that's not your path, right? And then Stella Adler is the other figure, who is the mother of method acting, and both Adler and Rabin had come to a point in their own lives where they decided that teaching was more important to them than their own artistic work, and they each understood themselves as belonging to an artistic tradition that they had inherited, and it was their role to pass along. And so they were radically democratic. I mean, anyone could come into the Adler studio and or Rabin's Carnegie Hall studio. And I think that I was interested in when I writing this, that's such a different way of transmitting artistic culture or knowledge than we have today. I mean, today so much of those worlds are professionalized, or people care about your degrees, or you do an MFA or those sorts of things. And these were two teachers who would not last a week in an MFA because they were brutal. There's a story about Rabin that's in the book that so if he didn't like something that a student painted, he would just walk over and he'd either knock the canvas off the easel and onto the floor, or he would just take his own paintbrush and start painting over it. And one day there's this young man who is, seemingly not taking in Rabin's lessons, and Rabin dips his paintbrush into this pool of paint, and he flicks the paint into this young man's eyes. And he says, "You like being blind?" But that was the artistic world. I'm not endorsing the more brutal approaches, but they were tough old Eastern European Jews who had suffered a great deal and who thought that art was really serious business. And they were there to figure out who they could impart these traditions to, and who they couldn't. And for me, it was great fun sort of being in their studio, because Adler and Rabin are both such great characters.
And I guess one day Bob Dylan walked into Norman Rabin's class. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's a remarkable story. So this is 1974. Dylan is at an absolute low point in his life. He's going through personal and artistic crisis. He feels that he hasn't written anything worthwhile since Blonde on Blonde, which is now 8 years before. He's 33. He feels that his best work has been done in the first half of his 20s. And, he basically feels he's at risk of becoming a has-been. And Rabin had a reputation for working with artists who were not painters and using painting to draw out in them what they needed to find for their own form. And Dylan has heard about this. So he comes to Rabin's class. And later, Dylan will say that Rabin is the person who turned him out of artistic crisis and into the album that became Blood on the Tracks. So I'll tell this story in the book, but I'll share it here. So Rabin had a practice where and students would go around and critique each other's canvases, right? And early on, when Dylan is there, it's his turn for the first time, right? And people are just saying to him, you know, your canvas looks like your lyrics sound. I mean, just kind of absurd flattery. And it comes to my mother, and she says, your composition is off. You chose the wrong colors. The painting is really harsh and uninviting. Like, you have a lot to learn. And he loves this. Because he hasn't come to be told he's a great artist. He knows he's not a great painter. He's come because he's in a moment of crisis, and he's trying to understand how to write more meaningful music. And for him, that comes through the painting. So he's immediately taken by her. And one day after class, he says to her, why don't you host a party at your place? And that's the first time they spent time outside the class.
Could you read to us a little bit about that party?
I could. There were already 24 people in the apartment by the time Dylan arrived. He wore a stained flannel shirt, blue jeans, and red cowboy boots. He stood in the center of my tiny walk-up as people tried and failed to make conversation with him. He nodded, murmured, looked straight at one person while he spoke a fragment of a sentence, then turned to someone else and said nothing in particular. He didn't seem to know what he wanted. He'd spent half his adult life accumulating fame and half running away from it, and all the contradiction was right there in his face. After 40 minutes, he still hadn't said hello to me. Every time I looked at him, his eyes were wandering over the aged wooden floorboards, the poetry and plays on the shelves, the cracked paint across the ceiling, the records stacked against the wall, the gaping hole where the heat pipes ran into the floor, as if the most banal detail of the dilapidated apartment was more intriguing than the people trying to speak with him. But maybe nobody was speaking to him. They were speaking to his songs, speaking to the memory of how his songs made them feel some night they kissed their high school love. Of course, he didn't want any of them wanting him. How could he talk back to any of that? People began to leave around 2 a.m. He closed the door behind the last guest with a sweep of his red cowboy boot. Then he turned to me, a hand in his mess of brown hair and that mischievous smile in his eyes, as he said, "Well, that was boring." It's a great pickup move. You suggest someone hosts a party, and then you make sure you're the last person to leave.
There's a lot more in the book, which you should all buy. So all three of the main characters in Boy, Evan based on you, June based on your mother, and Dylan are all trying to create a work of art out of their life. Could you tell us about how each character approaches that differently?
Yeah. Right. So, Dylan is going through the pain of his divorce. As I said, he's in this moment of personal artistic crisis. And what Rabin is teaching him is that rather than turn away from what's difficult in his life and look back to the music of the 60s, what he has to do is write from the pain of the present. And he starts writing the songs that become Blood on the Tracks. And so that section set in the 70s, this is the most intimate portrait that's been published of Dylan writing those songs. But what becomes complicated with Dylan is that once he does that, he can't do anything else but write more songs. Right? That life is always, this is something my mother comes to feel about him, that life is always going to be something that he's taking into his art. It's almost a one-way relationship. Whereas June, my mother's character, who has gone through very painful things up until this point in her life, and she's trying to understand those experiences through playing Hedda Gabler, the Ibsen title character. And
give us a little more about Hedda.
yeah, well, if you haven't read Hedda Gabler, it's the story of this young woman who's in an unhappy marriage, and this old lover from earlier in her life reappears, and she tries to decide which of these relationships is right for her, and then, sorry for the to spoil the plot, but by the end kills herself. And she feels that she can't live an authentic life. And this is considered one of the great feminist works of 19th century European drama, because it's a portrait of how she's trapped by the norms of her time, and there's no way out for her. And it's, although it's written by a man, it's an extraordinarily rich portrait of the misogyny that she encounters, and the ways in which being a woman forecloses having an authentic and full life. And my mother is playing this role and trying to understand the experiences that she has had with misogyny and sexism. And she comes to a point where she understands something more deeply about her life by playing this role. And then she realizes she has to leave the role behind because Hedda doesn't know how to heal. And the realization that my mother comes to by the end of that section set in the 1970s is that she's not going to find the love that's missing from her life on stage. She has to create that love in her life, not as an actress. Art isn't going to give it to her. And Dylan's certainly not going to give it to her, because for him, it's all about the next song. All right? And there's throughout 1974, she's trying to play this role. Dylan is writing these songs that become Blood. And she realizes she kind of has this hope that when they've both gone through these artistic journeys, they're just going to have quiet time with one another. And then by early 75, she realizes, no, he's just writing the next album. This is not how he works, right? So they have very different relationships to life and art. Rabin, their painting instructor, has a line that he says, art as a way of life. And Dylan would always repeat this, art as a way of life. And after he's written Blood and she's finished with Hedda Gabler, she has a moment where she realizes it's not a slogan. Dylan really means this. This is his life. There's nothing larger than the next song. And then Evan, my character, is going through something different. You know, he's left home, he's wanted to become a writer. He's had a sort of remarkable intellectual experience. He's got a great education. He's been thrilled to encounter the world of ideas, but he still can't write a worthwhile novel. And he feels that the novels that he's writing, they're insufficient in some way. And then when he comes home and he's spending time with his mother, and this is the most time they've spent together since he left home at 18, he's slowly coming into the realization that his writing is missing the spiritual and moral wisdom by which she has lived. And what he has to do is synthesize the intellect that he's developed by leaving home with the moral wisdom with which she raised him. And that bringing those two things together, right, that will give him a chance of writing a worthwhile novel. And so I think that's a sort of third way of thinking about life and art, that they're cyclical, that being attuned to life, to the people around us, can help us write or create a more worthy work of art, but also that art has to have a spiritual or moral dimension, that it has to teach us something about how we should live.
Which approach is your favorite? Don't I have to answer that question?
Next question. Yeah.
I know you wouldn't. Right. So Boy is in conversation with so many artists. You've talked about a few. You've talked about Chagall. You talked about Rabin. But could you talk to us about some of the others?
Well, one thing that I really wanted to do with the book is sort of synthesize all these different forms, all these different art forms. So there's a lot of theater in the book.
Mhm.
There's also a lot of poetry that's read aloud, both between me and my mother. My favorite scene in the whole book is this is just based on something that happened in life. Is one night my mom and I smoked her medical marijuana and just got really high and read poetry to each other. Um, and so there's poetry, there's theater, of course, there's a lot of music, there's painting. And I was interested in the ways in which these different forms accumulate and layer upon each other and give a deeper sense of meaning to one another. And that's been important for me as a writer, to draw not just from other writers but from other art forms as well. And so there's quite a bit about Chagall in here. Of course, the book is in conversation with Dylan's music. It's in conversation with Leonard Cohen's music. Cohen appears at a few different times. um, and um, I know, with Ibsen's drama. um, and yeah, it was important to me to bring that all together.
I guess last question from me, and then we'll open it up to the crowd. I want to talk to you about the experience of writing about death and grief and what kind of that emotional landscape does to your storytelling, what the experience was of writing those portions of the book.
Well, I mean, the book, I write very directly about the experience of being with someone you love at the end of their life. And, that was the most raw emotional experience I've ever had. And I wanted to speak and write truthfully about what that was like. And um, I think our culture often struggles to have meaningful and open conversations about grief and death. And, after my mother's death, I wasn't always sure where to put that grief, or, where to talk about that experience. And reading, books, those were important places for me, reading about other people's experience of something similar. Um, so I wanted to write directly about that experience, but I also wanted to write a book in which the love would be larger than the loss. And what would make it bearable to be with these two people as one is dying, um, is the sense that, you know, that her love would live on, and that will find other forms. And um, and that's the thing that carries you through grief and is larger than grief. And that was really important to me in how I told that story.
Could you read us one last passage about how you told that story?
So this is drawn from the very end of the book. And my character's in the hospital, sort of coming to terms with the realization that he's going to live and she's not, and um, how to confront that. The only way to live would be to tell. There was no alternative to memory and to story. It was only through recollection that I would be able to recreate the intimacy I felt now, in these fleeting hours, when I could still press my hand to my mother's gaunt cheek, or place my fingers in hers, and feel myself involuntarily absorbed by the rush of memory, conjured by the primordial touch of my skin against hers. For no matter how long I lived, or the distance I roamed from my origins, or the person I became, what could ever compare to the touch of my mother's skin, my first and most enduring impression of this world, the body from which I was born and, like a memory, like a story, passed on imperfectly into the world?
that, we'll open it up to any questions that you all might have.
Where in the Hudson Valley,
In Goshen.
which is near,
Goshen, Monroe, Chester, Warwick, some of those towns. Yeah.
You talked about a third of the book being from the perspective of your mother's character. Did you try to capture your actual mother's voice in that character? Did you try to differentiate? And how did you get into that, since it was a younger version of your mother that you never met that version, obviously?
Yeah, it's sort of, thanks. That's a wonderful question. Well, it's written as sort of told to. So the way those sections begin is it will be my mother said, and then we go and hear it in her voice. So it's first person in her voice. And that was a wonderful exercise for me because I had spent years and years talking to her. I mean, hundreds of hours of my life. And now in 90 pages, I had to distill the essence of this part of her life. And I really cared about trying to convey her voice, what it sounded like to listen to her. And I would read that section out loud to myself, and I would remember how she talked. And I would also read, she was a writer for the regional newspaper, and I would read pieces that she wrote. And when I could, I would slip an anecdote right from her writing into mine. And that, in a way, was the most difficult part, was trying to feel that I was capturing what it felt like to listen to her and what it felt like to talk to her. Yeah.
since this is a novel, not a biography or an autobiography, how, was there anything that you made up, scenarios that you created to move the narrative that didn't really happen?
People always think fiction is what is invented, but fiction is just what's left out. And that was the hardest thing to learn in the book, that this novel is 90,000 words, but the first draft was 160,000. And the fiction of this work was learning, what do I cut away? And sometimes I would ask myself, why am I writing this? Just because it happened to me? That's not a good enough reason. It has to sit within a narrative coherence, right? That is justified by the story. And that was the most difficult thing to learn.
So, in other words, my understanding of what you're saying is you didn't write anything false, but you didn't write everything. You took the pieces that you felt were the most important and wove them together to make this novel, which, had you made the movie, it might be 8 hours or 9 hours long.
Yeah. Well, false. That's an interesting. There's composition. There's certainly composition.
And I don't mean false like a
yeah.
bad thing, just something that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, there is certainly composition to move the story along, and there are also leaps where you recreate, especially the parts where I'm recreating aspects of my mother's life. If the details didn't feel, the narrative details needed a little push to get from one day to the next, or the morning to the afternoon, I wasn't precious about that. But what they had to serve was the larger narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I mean, I'll give you a really silly example if you want one. Like I went to 3 different universities, and when I first wrote it, I wrote about my experience at all 3 of those places, right? But then as the editing went on, and as those 160,000 words turned into 90, I realized one of those experiences, it was important in my life. It wasn't important in the book. So I folded those 2 experiences into one. And there are all sorts of things like that. Yeah.
Have you ever, because of your mother's experience, the influence of her, we understand it's amazing that you ever thought about instead not being a writer or being an actor, but your voice is unbelievable.
Oh, thank you.
He
Thank
read
you.
the audiobook.
No,
I did do the audiobook.
I mean, to be honest with you, because of your experience with her, or through her experience of being on stage, because she did so many artistic things. So, wondering, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I wrote a short film 7 or 8 years ago and made the great mistake of asking the friend who directed it if I could play the lead role. And I think that will happily be the last time that I act. But no, I mean, I think but I think part of what I tried to write about was the way in which a sort of artistic spirit moves between forms, and so I have no gift for acting, particularly. But I think something Norman Rabin taught and was trying to get at was the idea that whatever your form is, there is a certain artistic truth that if you're a musician or an actress, you can learn about through painting. And so I'd like to think that whatever that artistic truth is, it's fluid between these forms, but my form is definitely writing.
We might have time for one more question if anyone has one.
What are you doing next?
Yeah, I'm writing another novel, which has been wonderful, and I won't say too much about it because it's very, very early. But it's it's coming.
Thank you guys so much. We have books available for sale. I'm sure he'll sign them for you. Yeah, so congratulations.
Thank you.
For being here. That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
Yeah.
Can we have someone get our picture up here?